Today, it is my honour to invite Professor Femi Oyebode to talk about psychopathology and the self.
Thank you very much, Vaughan, for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very pleased to be here. I've never really thought of myself as a neuropsychiatrist, even though, to be truthful, Ken Davison, who was the most respected neuropsychiatrist in the northeast of England, in Newcastle, supervised my MD thesis, which was on epilepsy and schizophrenia. But I've stayed very firmly in the heart of general psychiatry. And as I was saying to Vaughan this morning, I'm just a jobbing general psychiatrist in large numbers of patients of various kinds. I'm pleased to be here, and even though I regard myself, if you were to ask me, what is my area of special interest, I regard myself really as a psychopathologist. But I regard myself as a psychopathologist who has a keen interest in the neurological underpinnings of abnormal phenomena. So that's how I see myself and my contribution to psychiatry. So this morning, I want to talk about the self, but it's always, and for me, it is always an excuse to talk about psychopathology, and to remind all of us that psychopathology is a foundational subject of psychiatry, and that it is not a dead subject, that it is not like Latin, that it is alive. Like, it's not to do with definitions or to do with history. It's a living subject which adapts and thrives in the face of daily clinical work. So that's, so standing up to speak to you is just an excuse to re-emphasize that. The other thing I wanted to do with it was to remind us that psychopathology has this ability to reveal to us the underpinnings of phenomena. So that just like when you have aphasia, it gives you a sense of what the abnormalities are in the brain, that essentially that the subject has subject psychiatry, that these abnormal phenomena reveal to us what it is, how the brain works, and that's what I want to pursue this morning. Usually, when one talks about the self, you would normally, kind of start off in a kind of Jasperian sort of way. You want to say, that there are these formal characteristics of the self, that the self, that it has a unity, that it has a continuity over time, that it has boundaries, and that it has a singular identity. And some people would add on to that there's this idea that there's a vitality, that we feel alive irrespective of whatever else is going on, that we know that we're alive. So that's how we would normally talk about it, and we would then try to see what the different abnormalities that patients bring to us, how they fit into this schema. But this morning, I'm going to take a kind of unusual route, because what I haven't said to you is the other thing I'm currently interested in is this idea that all psychiatrists, that we are the people who understand how the brain creates a sense of a reality. And because the patients bring to us these incredible experiences which tell us, a person hears a voice when there's no voice, nobody's speaking to them. So it gives us an idea of how does the brain construct our hearing people when they speak to us. That somebody sees something which is not there. So that gives us an opportunity to think about how the brain constructs the visual world that we see. So I want to try to do a little bit of work on the nature of reality, how it's created, and some of the phenomena that I'm going to talk about will reveal some of that to us. And I'm going to do it in a way that you'll be surprised. So I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about and my task is still to talk about the self, so I have to keep reminding myself that I'm here to be talking about the self. And so I'm going to start off by talking about phantom limb. Then I'll move on from phantom limb and talk a little bit about Charles Bonnet. Then I'll talk a bit about musical hallucinations. And then I'll pause just to summarize where I think I've got to. But the purpose of all of that, The purpose of all that meandering is really to talk about the nature of the self. And then I'll move on and say a little bit about autoscopy, which of course speaks directly to this business that I'm interested in, the whole idea of how the self is constructed. So I'm going to, every so often I'm going to need a prop, because my memory is not what it was. There was a time when I could have, when I could have just rehearsed the little excerpt which I want to get out of Dostoevsky's The Double, but I can no longer do that. So I have to actually read, read it out to you. So since this idea of the self and the idea of autoscopy, it's good to enter that space through this idea of the double. In English, you would say a wraith. So a wraith is this idea that you might see somebody who looks exactly like you, and usually it gives you the possibility, the premonition that you're likely to die very soon. And in the Icelandic sagas, they're called fetches, so a fetch, or in the German tradition, you might call it a doppelganger. So that's a territory that we want to enter into. Some of you will know that, of course, Dostoevsky himself had epilepsy, and a lot of people who have this experience of autoscopy, it flows out of epilepsy rather than from psychosis, even though I've had one or two patients who have experiences very similar to it. So, and you also know that Dostoevsky quite often put in his novels experiences that he himself had, but of course he put them in as part of his fictional narrative. So in The Double, he has this man who sees his double, and he says, "There was a stranger sitting before me on my own bed, also wearing a hat and a coat, faintly smiling, screwing up his eyes a little, and given him," this is Dostoevsky writing about, given him a friendly nod. Mr. Goliathkin wanted to cry out, but he was unable to. He wanted to protest in some way, but his strength failed him. His hair stood on end, and he squatted where he was, insensible with horror. And besides, he had good reason. Mr. Goliathkin had fully recognized his nocturnal friend. His nocturnal friend was none other than himself. Mr. Goliathkin in person, another Mr. Goliathkin, but identical to him in every way. In brief, in all respects, what is called his double. So that's Dostoevsky talking about this experience of the double. But of course, he starts off with a sense of presence. So this is my way of doing a very, very good early introduction, what autoscopy comprises of. So it comprises of the idea that you might have a sense of presence without seeing anything at all. It can also be that you have an autoscopic hallucination where you see somebody who looks like you, but it's distant from your material physical body. Or it might be that you have what used to be, what is still called, which Herman Berrius says that we really shouldn't make this distinction between autoscopic hallucination and what is called autoscopic proper. So in autoscopic proper, you can also see yourself, but you can have a sense of detachment from it, and it can look either small or big, or it can be grayed out, whereas in autoscopic hallucination, it looks exactly like you do. So you've got that, and then you've got this very, very rare experience, so rare that I've never actually read a real presented case until a trainee of mine, who's now a consultant, called me up about 6 weeks ago to say, "What do you think this is?" Which is a negative autoscopy, which is an extremely unusual experience. And Guy Maupassant, who wrote a short story called The Hauler, and Guy Maupassant himself is said to have experienced autoscopy throughout his life. So I'll read you a little bit of this, and then I'll come back to start to speak in the usual way. And he says, "So there I was, pretending to this presence, which I knew was spying on me, that I was reading. All of a sudden, I felt it reading over my shoulder, brushing against my ear. Leaping to my feet, I turned around so quickly that I nearly fell over. Believe it or not, though the room was bright as day, there was no sign of me in the mirror. It was empty, clear and full of light, but my reflection was not in it, despite the fact that I was standing directly in front of it. I looked at the large glass, clear now from top to bottom. I looked at it in terror. I dared not to take a step forward, knowing that this being was in between. I knew that although it would slip away from me again, its own invisible body had absorbed my own reflection. I was so frightened. Then suddenly I saw myself again to appear from the misty depths of the mirror, rising as if from a body of water. The following day, I came here and asked to be admitted. So he knew that there was something wrong with him, so he asked to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the story. So that's negative autoscopy, which is a very unusual experience. And it's definitely not, so it's not prosopagnosia. So it's not the person looking in the mirror and not recognizing who he can see. So it's definitely not that. And it's not, some form of, it's not hemianopsia or some form of anopsia because of course you can see everything else except for the reflection in the mirror. And I had thought that it was so rare, as I say, until about 6 weeks ago when somebody called me to say that they had a patient who was absolutely scared to death because he looked in the mirror and he couldn't see himself, which is the first time I've actually had somebody tell me that this is real. So that's the territory we're going to be walking through this morning. So if we start off, you might say, why on earth do I want to start off with phantom limb? But it should already be clear. So in phantom limb, that's the incredible condition which reveals to us what is usually not discussed. It reveals to us that we have a virtual body. So the idea that you've had an amputation, and even though you can't see your toes, you can wiggle them. So that tells us, it's always been a mystery to me why nobody discusses it in that light. Because what it does is that it tells us, of course we've now got a language for it because we've got computers. It tells us that underneath this physical material body of ours that we can touch and hit, that there is a virtual body which is there, and that virtual body actually experiences the world because the person who has had an amputation can feel as if they're still walking on the ground because if the feet that is being cut off can be experienced. So that's talking a little bit to tell us that it reveals this idea that there's something there hiding under this material body of ours. And that starts to get us to think about the idea that the brain itself is projecting that what we regard as ourself, this self which the philosophers and Descartes and all these people talk about endlessly, that self, that kind of virtual self, is there somewhere. So the question is how we can start to track it, to try to discuss it, and to try to understand how it's made up. And then the next leap is then to think about Charles Bonnet. So Charles Bonnet, you would think, why on earth would he be talking about Charles Bonnet in connection with an amputation, with a phantom limb? And the connection is that what you have in Charles Bonnet is that you have a relative reduction in sensory input. Because, of course, you have to have some cataract or something of that sort in order for you to have the release mechanism, which then gives you a projection of things which are there into the visual world. But you would have thought that the experiences that people have, the things which are projected, that they're random, but they're not random. And my task, because of course you do know that we could talk for an hour just on Charles Bonnet. So my task is not to go through Charles Bonnet and trying to prosecute the subject and take you through all the different aspects of what you can or can't see. But the point I want to make with it is that some of the things that you see in Charles Bonnet, the most common thing you see in Charles Bonnet are grid lines, which the patients tell us are like palisades, or sometimes they think they're brickwork. And my own father-in-law had it when he started to have visual loss in his old age. And because he was a mathematician, he saw them for what they were. They were just grid lines. So, and then you ask yourself, why don't we see those grid lines all the time? So we don't see those grid lines because we're overwhelmed with visual information. So those grid lines only become manifest when there's a reduction in sensory input. So that's the thing to keep in mind. That's why that's interesting for us. So there's, of course, you can, once I've said it, you don't need to be an expert in the area to be able to recognize what the grid lines are there for. So the grid lines are there, they're just exactly what Picasso would have used them for. They're there to show you where things are. So that when you move your head this way, you move your head back, you know where they are. So they're just log lines to help us be able to locate the visual world. But even more interesting in Charles Bonnet is the idea, and Oliver Sacks had a communication with Dominic Fitch. I don't know whether Dominic is here or not. He had correspondence with Dominic Fitch because Oliver Sacks, he wrote up a number of cases of professional musicians who had Charles Bonnet syndrome, but what they saw were music notation. And so he had this, that whether, Dominic, who is the expert on Charles Bonnet in this country, so they had this correspondence about, had he ever seen cases like that before, and so on. And of course, Oliver Sacks never says this, and I don't think he realized what it was. All the patients were saying, all they were seeing were the background informational systems, the little crosses and the little circles which the brain uses to navigate the world. That's all they were seeing. They themselves, the patients, told him that they couldn't play this set of music. So essentially, they were just interpreting them as musical notation because that's what they trained to be. So they weren't musical notations, in other words. And they told him he was there to be understood, if only he had thought of it like that. So what I've tried to do with the Charles Bonnet, without going into in-depth discussion about Charles Bonnet, is to say that when you have reduced sensory input, that reveals the mechanisms underneath our ability to perceive the world. And that is saying the same sort of stuff, which I want to move on to talk about in due course, about how our body itself, how it's composed, what it is made up of, and whether there are things hiding behind this material body of ours which are distinct from it, in other words. And then, of course, you will know that in deafness, that people can often hear music. And a lot of people who worked in this area of musical hallucinations, they think of musical hallucinations, of their associated musical hallucinations in deafness as a kind of analog, an auditory analog of Charles Bonnet. And that's all right. I don't dispute that at all. But of course, if you're thoughtful about these matters, your question straight away is, why on earth is it that it is not voices they're hearing? Why is it that you are deaf and what you hear is music? You have to answer that question, because if you don't answer that question, you are just repeating. Essentially, you're just writing the papers to describe what patients have, how patients are presented. So we know from Penfield's work, with all his stimulation of the brain of those people who were waiting to have surgery for epilepsy, for chronic epilepsy. And as you know, he stimulated the brains now to find out what was happening where. But we know from his work that the music that people heard when their brains were stimulated, they were almost always music which was they were hymns, or they were national anthems. So that's the first thing to say about the music they heard. And then, surprise, surprise, the music they heard was cohort dependent. So it was much more likely in the work that people have done with musical hallucinations, much more likely to be rock music if you were born in the 60s or thereabouts. So it looks as if it's music that was popular in your time, essentially. So that's still not answering the question about why is it that it's music you hear when you've got reduced sensory input into your auditory systems. And the current thinking on it is the idea that music is much more predictable than human speech. In other words, that if you hear a specific note, which all of us can do this, when you hear a specific note, it is easier to predict what's going to come next than it is to predict what's going to come next when you hear words. And so the idea is that the music occurs when there's reduction in sensory input into the auditory systems, precisely because the brain uses a kind of statistical method to make predictions. And of course, you know, like I do, that lots of work in today's neuropsychology, cognitive neuropsychiatry and cognitive neuropsychology depends on this idea of a positive predictive error, this idea that the brain is all the time working to make predictions. And I do know, of course, that some people use that same model to try to explain what happens in amputations and phantom limb. So to summarize what I'm trying to do, what I've been trying to do is to, not definitively, it's just to suggest, to excite you to think about these matters and to research them and to write and think about them and so on, is to suggest that these experiences and these phenomena that we see, that they hint at things that we should be taking very seriously and taking very interestingly indeed, and that they sometimes reveal the mechanisms which are sitting underneath these, that are sitting in the brain to help us to create the world that we experience and see and live in and so on. So to then move on, so I want to use this same sort of ideas to try to understand what may or may not be going on in autoscopy. So as I've said, what we have with autoscopy is that we've got the sense of presence, you've got the idea of autoscopic hallucinations, you have autoscopy proper, you can have negative autoscopy and so on. And what these experiences do is start to give us this notion that it is possible to have a material body and that you can then have a virtual body which is outside of the material body. So if you take a look at the autoscopy hallucination, so autoscopic hallucination, the image that is perceived by the patient is usually like a mirror image. And it can mirror, not necessarily all the time, it can mirror the patient's own actions. And in autoscopy proper, it is generally speaking not a mirror image. And it can be beside the person, it can be sitting or standing, and as I've said before, it's usually very gray, but it can be smaller or it can be bigger, and so on. So what are the component parts of that, what I've just described? The component parts of it are that in autoscopy, either in autoscopic hallucination or in autoscopy proper, the visual spatial perspective always resides in the material body. So you never have the patient say that the virtual body is the one that is seeing the material body standing or sitting. So that starts to get us to think about a body-centered perspective. And of course, once I start to talk about the body-centered perspective, you know that at some point I want to discuss whether it is possible to have an extra corporeal perspective. And even though they sound mystical, nonetheless, we have to handle this material because the patients experience it and we have to try to come to terms with them. So just to summarize, with the autoscopic hallucination and autoscopy proper, the experiencing patient, what they are seeing is their physical body, sees somebody who looks exactly like they do, but that person is outside of them, but it is not that virtual body that is seeing them. So that's the case we want to make, and we want to rest it there. And of course, you will know that Olaf Blanker, who's the guy who's done most of the work in this area, has reviewed the neurological literature and done extensive work on these patients. And a few of these patients with epilepsy have experiences where the virtual body, the extracorporeal, what he calls the parasomatic body, has sensory experience, which is a weird thing to say. So the body the virtual body can see the material body, and the material body is inert. So it is a virtual body that's moving, and it is the material body which is static. which is a very strange thing to imagine at all. And the virtual body can give this, we're not talking about out-of-body experience of near-death experiences, so we leave that totally to one side because that's not an area that I want to go to. So this virtual body can perceive the world from whichever position it's in, which is very strange. But of course, what Olaf Blanke does, which is a wonderful, wonderful experimental kind of just thought experiment, which is extraordinary, just to make it much more easy for us to accept that these experiences occur, is to remind us that if you were to ask me to tell you what is behind me, I can tell you what is behind me. You know, if you were to ask me to tell you what's in my bedroom, and you tell me to tell you from standing by the door, or to stand from the loo, or to stand from the windows, I can tell you. So what he's trying to do, what Olaf Blanke is trying to do, is to remind us that this idea that a virtual body can experience the world from different perspectives, which is different from where the material body is currently sat, is not as far-fetched as you can imagine. Because we're all of us doing that all the time. And therefore, because we can all of us do that all the time, we mustn't be overly preoccupied about the impossibility of a virtual body which is able to see the world when the physical body feels inert and so on. But there's much more to it than that. So one of the things they've shown, is that there's a pattern to it. So with the autoscopy, which our psychiatrists are likely to see, it is almost always occurring with a patient who is standing or sitting at the time, and with the virtual experience also standing or sitting at the time. Whereas with the patients with epilepsy who have what you might call an out-of-the-body experience, where the virtual body has the sensory experiences, the sensory experiences almost always occur from an elevated position, and the patients complain of feeling giddy or having vertigo. And this is important because the point that Blanke wants to make is that these tells us something about the composition, how the self is made up of. So he wants to make the case that there's a self which is created by the otholates, and that is a self where you've got problems with your inner ear, and the self can float. And there's a self which is to do with vision, to do with being able to look at ourselves in this way. And of course he wants to make the case, and this is of course speculating and projecting these matters to the future. He wants to make the case that, of course, that there's a kinesthetic self. And that reminded me of a patient I had many years ago who thought that, not thought, because the thought always makes it look as if it's imagination, but you couldn't see his hand apart from where the physical hand was, but he felt that where the hand was not where the material hand was. In other words, he experienced his hand as being in a different place from where he was sensing it himself. And that made me think at the time that that's like a kinesthetic experience, so that even though his arm was here, but he felt it was here somewhere. And that seemed to be a sense in which there was a dislocation between how his kinesthetic self, the proprioception, was distinct from actually the material body and so on. So to summarize, what I think I've been saying is that these phenomena that we see in psychiatry, that these phenomena give us the opportunity to start to think a little bit more deeply about the processes underlying them. Now, the self, of course, is the most complicated area of our subject to talk about. I suppose thinking is the most complicated, if I'm truthful about it, but the self is also quite complicated. And as you talk about it, you have to be able to separate yourself from how you are now as a normal person without any abnormalities, and then start to imagine what it is like for the patients. So I don't think I want to say much more. I was going to speak for about 30 minutes. But of course, I'm always better in response to questions. So I'm very pleased to respond to your comments or queries and so on. So thank you very much for your patience.
I wonder if we could just have the lights up. Thank you, folks. I see a couple of hands up in the middle, and gentleman over there next.
Hi, thanks for that talk, it was great. I just wondered what kind of psychiatric comorbidity you might see with autoscopy, and how phenomena like depersonalization fits into that, or kind of dissociative experiences.
In autoscopy proper, the patients describe what you might want to call depersonalization. They use words like a sense of detachment from the observed self, which is outside of the material body. But I don't. I think you wouldn't normally want to. I've had this conversation last night. I'm not very keen on the idea of using words like dimensions or spectrum, because that makes us very lazy. It makes you think that all you have to do is just, one is one end and the other. Essentially, it's a matter of severity when it's not true. It's not a matter of severity. I mean, primary depersonalization is a condition in its own right, and it is very rare. And they never say they can see themselves outside. All they're saying is that I feel as if I'm an automata, so there's a lack of engagement with the self. So they're not the same things. But as I've said, there is some account that makes it look as if there's some kind of depersonalization or kind of sense of detachment or a kind of sense of estrangement in autoscopy proper.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Fascinating talk, very thought-provoking. I always believe that psychopathology is the alphabet of the language we speak. And in neuropsychiatry, I think probably it's even more important than in other bits of psychiatry, where we're seeing unusual psychopathology, unusual phenomena as in relation to various neurological lesions. And sometimes people have become lazy in trying to delineate and how quickly somebody, gives a diagnosis of psychosis when there is an unusual phenomenon perceptually. How far do you think we should be going to delineate that, and how far the treatment should be guided by psychopathology? Because I think that's something getting increasingly delayed.
I mean, of course, I agree with you without any question at all. I think there's a kind of premature closure in psychiatry at present. We kind of the idea that nosology is everything. The idea that something called schizophrenia exists, and the kind of pollution of psychiatric practice by the recipe systems that the DSM has introduced, which means that people no longer listen to the patients and they're just ticking a box. So there is a problem, a deep problem in psychiatry at present, which is a crisis, you could argue. So I agree with you about that. I think that there's if I might step aside from talking about the self for a minute and just talk, because the point I want to make is better made with hallucinations. So for example, people just want to say whether they found a third-person auditory hallucination or not, and they want to know whether or not the patient, whether they hear other people talking about them, and that's the end of it. But of course, nobody asks a fundamental question about there's a syntax in there, because the third-person auditory hallucination is syntactical. Why isn't it a second-person auditory hallucination? To make those distinctions is absolutely crucial to make that distinction. But not just to make it in a lazy sort of way, but to worry over it, to worry, why on earth is it that? And we have some notion of why it might be that. You know, and why do you get a command hallucination? And when you get a command hallucination, that's a command hallucination, that's a syntactical. And why is it a command hallucination? I mean, you know, you can't just go to bed thinking, oh yes, you know, I had a patient yesterday who had a command hallucination. So I think that the idea that there's a difference between inner speech and private speech. You know, so Vygotsky, for example, said that, that when you are a child and you are being taught how to do something, in rehearsal to yourself, you use what you call private speech. And private speech is the closest thing you can get to a command hallucination. And I can remember my father teaching me how to do my shoelaces up. And I can remember rehearsing in words what he taught me how to do my shoelaces. I can still remember it, and I'm 68 years of age now. So what I'm trying to say is that the phenomena is interesting, but they're not an end. They are fundamentally interesting. And there is a kind of premature foreclosure, the idea that you just, you know, in group A, if you have one, and in group P, if you have two, then you have something called schizophrenia. Well, that's a pretty dim way of organizing clinical medicine. You know, and also that implies that somehow you know what this schizophrenia is. Whereas actually, so all the kinds of conflations that you get in the results, some of that goes to the idea that we haven't actually studied properly the fundamental abnormalities which are present, which I hope is what my talk is about. My talk isn't really about the self. It's much more to do with encouraging people to think about these phenomena, to be properly interested in them, so when your patients talk to you about them, to let it worry you, and then to start to think about what on earth it could mean.
Thank you, Adam. And Camilla.
Thanks very much. Very much enjoyed the talk. There are things we see that aren't there that appear to be in some kind of virtual space, and there are things we see that aren't there that appear to be out in the world. And in both cases, we may or we may not take them to be real. Can you give us a little tour around the territory of hallucination versus pseudo-hallucination and the relevance of insight?
Yeah, well, it's a problematic it's a problematic area, and but I'm happy to talk about it. So the first thing is the word pseudo is a problem. And as the previous speaker said, you know, we in our subject psychiatry, it's language embedded, and the language is used as code for all sorts of things. So the word pseudo in English implies something is false, and I wish they'd never used that term. So that's a big problem. So you will know, like I do, that you know, the idea, Jasper's idea is very simple. You know, Jasper's idea is, he just gave these formal characteristics of what a normal true perception is. And he said that a normal true perception occurs outside of you. It has a character of objectivity, that it appears full and fresh, and that it occurs to you with a feeling of passivity. I mean, he's wrong with that one, but that's what he said. And essentially what he was trying to do was to say a hallucination is exactly the same as a real perception as he's just described it, without an object, in the absence of an object. That's what he was trying to do. He made an error in the sense that he used a visual experience as the hallmark of what a hallucination is, when actually these characteristics, they are different. They're just different. For smell, they're different. For tactile experiences are different. You know, so sound is different. So what I mean by that is that the time signature for these experiences are completely different. Just completely different. You guys are there. If I move my head and come back, you're still there. So the time in other words, the duration of the experience is very different from a smell. And the duration of experience is also completely different from hearing things. So if you, as you know, in the theater, you're still seeing them, but if you're not paying attention, you can't hear what they've said. It's gone. You know, so there's work to be done, and you could say maybe I should be doing it. You know, there's work to be done to revise Jasper's original formal characteristics for what a true perception is. So what the Russian guy, Kandinsky, I think he is, what he then did was he took those things and then, because he himself experienced them when he was ill, so he took this formal characteristics of what the visual experience was, and he then used that to say what a pseudo-hallucination is, except that he knew that he was experiencing them. Do you see what I mean? So that was the point he was making, that he knew that they were abnormal. He knew that he was experiencing them. So he used this idea that your awareness of the abnormality of it made it different from the patients who genuinely, totally are convinced that it's happening. You know, so that's the distinction they try to. I myself have got problems with the idea of using intellect to make the distinction between a veridical experience and an abnormal experience. So I've got my own problems. But I teach it as I've just taught it, that people use that. And it is helpful to you know, it is helpful to use that sort of way of doing it, of trying to make the distinction. But the point I really make with it is that how would you then classify, where would you say a pseudo-tactile hallucination was? It is very easy to know what a pseudo-visual hallucination is. But it's very, very hard to know what a pseudo-tactile hallucination is. It's even harder to know what an olfactory hallucination is. Is it a hallucination or is it an idea? Is it a belief? Do you know what I mean? Because smell is funny, because, you know, I can say I smell something, and you can say I can't smell it. And we're not about to say to me, you know, Femi, you're having a hallucination. Because I say, what do you mean? I say, you're just impervious to smells. Do you see what I mean? So smell is a funny one, which of course, as you know, quite often people say they've got olfactory delusions. You know when actually what they've got is olfactory hallucinations. But because we can't be sure, so language matters, insight matters a bit, and the actual nature of the sensory modality also matters, because we're using the yardstick of vision, which doesn't fit all perceptions. And we never, very, 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 very rarely talk about proprioceptive hallucinations or kinesthetic hallucinations. And we ought to, because of course the patients often talk about them, but they talk about them as if they were delusions. So for example, my patients will say, you know, they had my hand behind my back and they were pushing it, and it was very painful. You know, and then we just report it in the notes that they had delusions, that somebody, the persecutory delusions and so on. But the really interesting thing was they felt that their hands was behind their back. Yeah. And somebody was pushing it up and squeezing it and so on. This ability, which again goes back to the previous question, is this ability to be properly interested, to listen properly to what people are saying so that you actually hear it. And because getting it right matters, because it tells us something about how the brain works.
Thank you. Camilla, and then if we have time, Norman and Mark.
Thanks. I was curious what you thought about experiments showing the malleability of the bodily self outside of the context of psychopathology.
Yes.
The rubber hand delusion, or Tamar Mackin's work where people get a third thumb and then the representations in the brain change.
Yes, I agree totally with you. I thought I'd keep all that out because, of course, the most interesting aspect of all of Blanca's work is what you're discussing, the ability to get a person, a normal person who's not ill, hasn't got epilepsy, you get a normal person to think their body is 10 yards ahead in front of them, to experience they're physically sitting here and they experience their body is over there. Very clever. So yes, that's true. And of course he uses all that which I didn't want to do all that work because actually, you know, you need to have visual, you know, I need to do a PowerPoint and all that, and I don't want to do PowerPoint. You know, so to show you that you have, we definitely have graviceptive receptors, because we just know that, that you can feel you're floating where you're not. You can feel you're upside down where you're not. You know, and you can feel that the room itself is upside down and you're standing on your head when you're actually standing on your feet. So we just know that these ortholates do work, and that these ortholates, they were developed in this planet, and they're responding to the gravity on this planet. And therefore, when we finally get to Mars, we will discover we don't know where our bodies are and so on. You know, so, and we just got to be aware of that. So it's very, very, so I'm agreeing with you. And of course, you're hinting at the other thing, which you hinted at, which is the most, you know, Ramachandran's work with phantom limbs. So Ramachandran's work with phantom limbs are absolutely extraordinary. How he came about it, very simple, but how he came about it is a mystery to me. That, as you know, when you have if you had a traumatic injury to your arm, and your arm was amputated, quite often your arm takes the position that it was at when it was amputated or when it was injured. So it can be like that, and you can't open it out. And not just that, the muscles, even they're no longer there. The muscles go into cramp. You know, it's crazy stuff, you know, that you no longer have an arm, and your muscles can go into cramp and be painful. And Ramachandran discovered that all you had to do was put a mirror there of the normal arm and lay them side by side, and you get the normal arm, you move it like that, and that arm, which is not there, can start to be pumped up and down, and can release it, can make it easier, less painful, less cramped, and so on. So obviously, he's tricking the brain using visual pathways to pretend that the arm that's been cut is still there, and then persuades the brain to move it. And then it becomes easier, and then gradually it does what it should have done. It starts to telescope back in, and then disappears, and the person can be cured. So which is just extraordinary to imagine that that is possible. And that is now standard treatment that people use and so on. But again, that's speaking to what I've been speaking about, which is that we have to be constantly interested properly in these phenomena, both the ones that are generated in normal people, but also the ones that the patients present to us themselves.
Apologies, I think I missed a couple of hands there. Norman, apologies. I think you had that earlier than I noticed. I think we're going to have to finish there. Just massive thanks. Femi, thank you so much for coming and doing the JNMP lecture. And if we could all thank Femi, I think it would be widely appreciated.